Look, everyone has done this. Sometimes thing goes wrong. A breakup, a bad day, a diagnosis, a fight with someone you love, and before you even think about it, you are standing at an open freezer with a spoon in your hand, eating ice cream straight out of the tub. It is not really about hunger. It is about needing something familiar to hold on to when everything else feels like it is falling apart. Now take that exact same instinct and put it on a sinking warship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. May 8, 1942. The Coral Sea. Black smoke is pouring out of the deck of the USS Lexington, one of the most powerful aircraft carriers in the entire United States Navy. A Japanese torpedo has just torn a hole in her hull below the waterline. Fuel vapor is leaking into the lower decks. Somewhere inside the ship, an officer is screaming the order every sailor dreads. Abandon ship. Get to the boats. Get off the Lexington now. And in the middle of all of it, in the final minutes before more than 2,000 men jump into the burning Pacific, a group of sailors do something almost impossible to believe. They do not run for the lifeboats first. They run for the freezer. They break it open. And standing on a sinking warship, with fire spreading behind them and the order to evacuate already given, they eat. Every last container of ice cream on board the Lexington gone before the ship goes down with the rest. Sounds like a joke. It is not. It is a documented detail from survivor accounts of that day. Men who had minutes, maybe less, before the ship went under, chose to spend some of those minutes on dessert. One survivor later described the scene simply. We were not going to let it go down with the ship. It is not even the strangest part of this story. Because 3 years later, the United States Navy would do something even harder to believe. It would spend more than $1 million of wartime money, at a time when steel was so scarce that battleships were being rationed, to build something the Navy had never built before and has never built since. A literal floating ice cream factory. A concrete barge with no engine of its own, towed across the Pacific, whose only job was making frozen dessert for exhausted sailors thousands of miles from home. Somewhere in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, the most powerful military on Earth decided that ice cream was not a luxury. It was a weapon. A weapon against homesickness, against fear, against the kind of exhaustion that breaks men faster than bullets do. So how does a dessert end up with that kind of power? How does the same thing you reach for after a bad breakup end up worth an actual battleship? To answer that, we have to go back a long way. Not decades. Not centuries. Over 2,000 years, to a mountain in ancient China, long before anyone on Earth had ever heard the words ice cream. Around 200 years before the Common Era in China, someone discovered that if you packed milk and rice into snow, the mixture would freeze into something rich and satisfying, a texture unlike anything nature makes on its own. It is the earliest confirmed frozen dessert in the historical record. Not a legend. Not a myth repeated in a cookbook centuries later. An actual documented practice in actual ancient China, nearly 1,000 years before Europe would even begin telling its own ice cream stories. By the time of the Tang Dynasty, several centuries later, Chinese emperors had turned this into something extraordinary. Fermented buffalo and cow milk, thickened with flour, flavored with a sharp evergreen oil called camphor, packed into metal tubes, and frozen using ice hauled down from the mountains. One emperor reportedly kept a staff of 94 men whose entire job was managing ice for the palace. 94 men employed full-time, so that the emperor could have a frozen treat whenever he wanted one. Picture what that job actually looked like. 94 men in the heat of a Chinese summer, hauling ice down from distant mountains on foot, packing it in insulated stores fast enough that it would not melt before the emperor wanted it. An entire small workforce existed for one purpose only, so that one man could taste something cold whenever the mood struck him. Everyone else in that empire simply sweated through the summer like they always had. This detail matters because it tells you something that will repeat again and again throughout this story. From the very first moment frozen dessert appears in human history, it is not for everyone. It is for the person at the top. Ordinary people do not get anywhere near it. Thousands of miles away in ancient Persia, nobility were doing something strikingly similar without any contact with China at all. Servants hauled snow down from the mountains and poured chilled grape juice and fruit over it for the ruling class. Centuries later, Persians would develop faluda, a mix of rose water, thin noodles and ice, and give the world a word that still survives today: sherbet, the ancestor of sherbet. In Greece, snow used to cool wine was being sold in the streets of Athens as early as the 5th century before the Common Era, ordinary vendors hawking chilled cups to anyone willing to pay. And in Rome, legend holds that the Emperor Nero sent runners sprinting into the mountains the moment he wanted something cold, men racing against melting snow with the emperor's mood as the only deadline that mattered, the snow then mixed with honey and fruit pulp for his table. Historians cannot confirm this actually happened exactly as the story goes. It may be exaggeration passed down for centuries. But true or not, the pattern is unmistakable. Across 3 separate civilizations with no contact between them, the same idea kept reappearing. Chill something sweet and it becomes something only power can afford. Nobody had figured out how to control that cold yet. That breakthrough would not come from an emperor or a king at all. It came from chemists. Between the 8th and 10th centuries in the Islamic Golden Age, cooks across Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo began systematically combining milk, sugar, and flavorings, effectively creating the direct ancestor of both sherbet and ice cream as we understand them today. And then came the discovery that changed everything. In the 10th century, Muslim chemists worked out how to manufacture ice itself through chemical reactions, without depending on snow, without depending on mountains, without depending on winter at all. Think about what that actually means. For over 1,000 years, frozen dessert had been a hostage of geography. You needed snow. You needed mountains nearby. You needed servants willing to run for miles carrying ice before it melted. And now, for the first time, someone had found a way to make the cold itself on demand anywhere. This single discovery is the hinge the entire rest of this story swings on. Every scoop of ice cream anyone has ever eaten in a warm climate, in a place with no mountains, no snow, no winter at all, traces back to unnamed chemists in Baghdad who solved a problem that had limited this dessert for 1,000 years. And almost nobody watching this has ever heard their names, while everyone has heard of a French queen who probably never actually served a single bowl of it. This is arguably the single most important turning point in this entire 2,000-year story, and it is the one detail almost nobody has ever heard. There is one more detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story, and it matters because it quietly undercuts the entire legend that is about to come next. Sicily itself was an Islamic emirate for over a century, from 965 to 1072. Which means these exact techniques, milk sweetened with sugar, flavored ices refined by real chemistry, may have taken root on Italian soil directly, generations before any French queen or English king ever entered the picture at all. From here the story moves to Europe. And this is where things get complicated because almost everything most people think they know about this next part is not true. You have probably heard this one before. 14-year-old Catherine de' Medici leaves Florence in 1533 to marry the future King Henry II of France, and brings with her a personal chef named Ruggieri, who supposedly serves a different flavored ice to the French court every single day of her month-long wedding celebration. It is a wonderful story. Lemon one day, wild strawberry the next. A teenage bride dazzling an entire royal court with frozen desserts nobody there had ever tasted. There is just one problem. It probably never happened. Food historians have looked for documentation of this story for years, and found nothing. Not a single record from the 1500s mentions it. The earliest known version of the Medici ice cream story does not appear in print until the 1800s, nearly 300 years after it supposedly took place. Most researchers now believe it was invented by 19th-century ice cream sellers looking for a marketing angle, a way to make their product sound aristocratic and exotic. And it does not stop there. You may have also heard that a century later, England's King Charles I was so obsessed with what he called cream ice that he paid his personal chef a lifetime pension, just to keep the recipe secret from everyone outside the royal family. The story goes that after Charles was executed in 1649, the recipe finally leaked to the public, and ice cream escaped the palace at last. In the version of the story usually told, the king's chef is summoned privately, offered a pension for the rest of his life, on one condition, that the recipe never leaves the palace kitchen. The chef agrees. The secret holds for years. And then, in January of 1649, Charles is marched out in public and executed, and within days, so the legend goes, the recipe that supposedly died with his household finally makes its way out into the world. It is a fantastic scene. A doomed king clinging to one last exclusive luxury even as his entire kingdom turns against him. It would make an incredible moment in a film. Same problem. No documentation. Same 19th century origin as the Medici story. Two of the most famous origin legends in all of ice cream history, both repeated in cookbooks, articles, and documentaries for 150 years, and neither one of them can be proven to have happened at all. Even the Marco Polo version of this story, the one about a Venetian explorer smuggling Chinese ice cream technique back to Italy in 1295, does not hold up well under scrutiny. Historians point out that the knowledge developed in the Islamic world almost certainly reached Europe through other, far less romantic channels, ordinary trade routes, merchants moving goods and ideas back and forth across the Mediterranean for generations, with no single dramatic courier required at all. Think about why these two particular stories caught on so hard. A teenage bride dazzling a foreign court. A doomed king willing to buy secrecy at any price, only for the secret to escape the moment his head did. They are not history. They are marketing dressed up as history, and it worked so well that it is still being repeated as fact today. Here is what we can actually prove instead. The first known French recipe for flavored ices appears in writing in 1674, in a book by Nicolas Lemery. And sometime in the 1680s, a Sicilian named Francesco Procopio de Caltelli opened a café in Paris that would become one of the very first places where an ordinary person, not a king, not a queen, could simply walk in and buy ice cream for themselves. That is the real turning point. Not a royal wedding. Not a beheaded king. A café door open to the public for anyone who could pay. If you are enjoying uncovering the real story behind the legends everyone assumes are true, this channel exists entirely for moments exactly like this one. Hit subscribe now because the story is about to cross an ocean, and it only gets stranger from here. Ice cream reached the American colonies by the mid-1700s, and it found its way almost immediately to the very top of American society. George Washington was, by every account, obsessed with it. Merchant records from a shop on Chatham Street in New York show Washington spending roughly $200 on ice cream in a single summer, in 1790, an enormous sum for the time. He had a cream machine for ice installed at Mount Vernon in 1784, the same year he ordered an ice house built on his own property. Thomas Jefferson took it even further. He wrote down what is believed to be the first American ice cream recipe, an 18-step process that still survives today in the Library of Congress, likely learned from his French butler, Adrien Petit. Jefferson liked to serve his guests something almost theatrical, ice cream sealed inside warm pastry so that it looked, from the outside, exactly like it had just come out of the oven. One senator's wife, dining at his table, wrote home afterward describing her astonishment at what she called baked ice cream, warm on the outside and impossibly frozen within. Dolly Madison served an elaborate strawberry ice cream at her husband's second inaugural banquet in 1813, and popular legend often credits her with inventing ice cream altogether, or bringing it to America for the first time. That is not true either. She did not invent it. But she understood exactly what it represented, and she used it deliberately as a symbol of celebration and status at the highest table in the country. At the president's house during Jefferson's own final New Year reception, one guest later wrote home describing servers moving through the crowded room handing out cake, wine, punch, and ice cream, so freely that anyone who missed the first round could simply walk to the sideboard and help themselves again. In a young country still working out what its own aristocracy was even supposed to look like, ice cream had already become the answer. If you wanted to signal that you had made it, this is what you served. For nearly 2,000 years, across 4 continents, one pattern had never broken. Ice cream was for emperors, for kings, for presidents. It was never for everyone. That was about to change, and not because of a king or a president at all. It was about to change because of an overworked woman with a patent worth $200, and a dairyman trying to keep his milk from going to waste. In 1843, a woman named Nancy Maria Donaldson Johnson, living in Philadelphia, patented something she called the artificial freezer. Before her invention, making ice cream meant the pot freezer method, a metal pot of cream surrounded by ice, stirred continuously by hand with nothing but a spoon for a punishing stretch of time. It was slow. It was exhausting. And it meant ice cream stayed out of reach for anyone without servants to do the stirring. Johnson's design changed the physics of the whole process. A wooden tub packed with ice and salt surrounded a metal container, and a hand crank on top turned an internal paddle that scraped fresh ice crystals off the walls as it spun, producing something smoother, faster, with a fraction of the effort. And in an era when women inventors were routinely erased from their own work, Johnson insisted on putting her own name on the patent application herself. She sold that patent for $200. She never got rich from an invention that would go on to reshape a global industry, and whose basic design is still recognizable in home ice cream makers sold today. She died in 1890 at 95 years old, having lived just long enough to watch her invention become the new standard everywhere, in kitchens that had no idea her name was attached to what they were using. Before her patent, making ice cream at home could take the better part of an afternoon of continuous stirring, an activity reserved for households with servants to spare on something so unproductive. After it, a family with nothing more than ice, salt, and a crank could make it themselves in under an hour. That is the actual mechanism by which a 2,000-year-old royal luxury became something an ordinary household could produce on a Sunday afternoon. Not a decree. Not a revolution. One woman's patent, sold for less than the cost of a good coat. Picture Johnson herself, walking into the patent office in Philadelphia in September of 1843, handing over drawings of a wooden tub, a metal cylinder, a crank, and a simple rotating paddle, and insisting the clerk record her own name on the document rather than a husband's or a male relative's, at a time when that alone took a kind of quiet stubbornness. She had no way of knowing that design would still be recognizable in machines sold nearly 200 years later. She just wanted a faster way to make dessert without stirring a pot for half a day. 8 years after Johnson's patent, in 1851, a Baltimore milk dealer named Jacob Fussell had a much simpler problem. Dairy farmers around him in Pennsylvania were producing more cream than the local market could absorb, and unsold cream does not wait patiently, it spoils, and spoiled cream is money thrown away. Fussell was not trying to reinvent a 2,000-year-old royal dessert. He was trying to stop losing money on milk nobody was buying fast enough. Freezing it into ice cream solved both problems at once. It used up the surplus and it created a product that did not need to be sold within a day or two. So he opened what is considered the first commercial ice cream factory in the country, in Seven Valleys, Pennsylvania, and shipped his product first to Baltimore, then to New York, then to Boston. Neither Johnson nor Fussell set out to democratize a 2,000-year-old imperial luxury. One was solving a labor problem in her kitchen. The other was solving a spoilage problem in his dairy business. And between the two of them, they accidentally finished what 1,000 years of kings and chemists had started. Ice cream stopped being something only the powerful could have. And as it spread, every culture that touched it reshaped it into something of its own. Italian ices became gelato. Indian kitchens produced kulfi, still made in a cylindrical mold almost identical to the metal tubes Tang Dynasty servants once used centuries earlier. The same basic idea, frozen sweetened dairy, kept reappearing everywhere it traveled. wearing a different name and a different flavor in every country it touched. By the later 1800s, ice cream was industrial. It was affordable. A working-class family in an American city could buy it from a street vendor for a few pennies, something that would have been unthinkable to a Tang Dynasty peasant, or a Roman citizen watching Nero's snow get carried past them toward the palace. But it had not yet found the use that would cement it permanently into a nation's identity. That would take an actual war. By 1914, alcohol had already been banned aboard Navy vessels, years before nationwide prohibition arrived. Sailors were furious about it. One crew was reportedly so annoyed by the new rule that they renamed a captured vessel USS Piffle, a small, bitter joke aimed straight at Washington. But the rule stuck, and when nationwide prohibition followed a few years later, an entire industry had to reinvent itself overnight. Breweries scrambled to adapt, and some retooled their beer-making equipment to produce ice cream instead. Saloons across the country converted into diners built around soda fountain counters, the exact shape most people now picture when they think of old-fashioned American ice cream culture. Then came World War I and something unexpected happened. A German officer, describing the American military with contempt, reportedly called them that nation of ice cream eaters, intending it as an insult. Americans took it as a compliment instead, and ice cream was officially exempted from wartime sugar rationing, treated as something close to essential for troop morale. The dessert that had once belonged exclusively to emperors was now, officially, a matter of national pride. In 1904, at the St. Louis World's Fair, one more piece of the puzzle fell into place. Before this, street vendors sold ice cream in small glass cups called penny licks. The same cup, used over and over all day long, handed to one stranger after another, rinsed hastily if at all, and passed to the next customer in line. Nobody thought much of it at the time. It was simply how the dessert had always been sold on a street corner. At the fair itself, with nearly 20 million visitors and more than 50 ice cream stands competing for business, the story goes that one vendor ran out of dishes entirely. Right next door was a teenage Syrian immigrant named Ernest Hamwi, selling a thin waffle-like pastry called zalabia. With a frustrated vendor staring at an empty dish rack and a line of customers not going anywhere, Hamwi grabbed one of his own pastries, still warm, and rolled it into a cone shape on the spot, handing it over to hold the ice cream instead. Decades later, he described the reaction in his own words, saying simply that the idea seemed to go over big. Within days, every ice cream stand at the fair was buying rolled waffles from him instead of using glass cups at all. At least 7 different people at that same fair would later claim they invented the cone first. Historians now generally agree the fair did not invent it so much as it made it impossible to ignore, sending it out across the entire country within months. A teenage immigrant, improvising with whatever was in front of him in the middle of a chaotic, overcrowded fairground, permanently changed the way the entire world eats this dessert, with a hand instead of a spoon. Everything up to this point had been leading somewhere. Toward the moment ice cream stopped being a treat, and became something closer to a strategic asset. Which brings us back to where we started. World War II. Somewhere in Washington, an assistant to the Undersecretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, sat down and wrote something that, on paper, sounds almost absurd for a wartime military memo. He warned, in effect, that his own department had been getting something dangerously wrong. That out of every single factor affecting the morale of exhausted men fighting a war across the entire Pacific, ice cream had been the one most badly neglected. Not ammunition. Not mail from home. Ice cream. Forrestal did not laugh it off. He took it seriously enough to act on it. The Army's Quartermaster Corps responded by supplying enough machinery and ingredients to produce roughly 80 million gallons of ice cream a year. In 1943 alone, the military shipped 135 million pounds of dehydrated ice cream mix straight to the front lines. By February of 1945, the Army was building ice cream factories close enough to the fighting to deliver half-pint cartons directly into foxholes. And then the Navy went even further. In 1945, it converted a concrete army transport barge, built from concrete because wartime shortages had made steel too precious to spare, into the world's first floating ice cream factory. 265 feet long. Over $1 million, close to $17 million in today's money. No engine of its own, towed from ship to ship across the Pacific, producing roughly 500 gallons of ice cream every single shift. Sailors nicknamed the small treat counters built into their ships Gedunk bars, and getting time at the Gedunk bar became one of the few genuine comforts available on a warship thousands of miles from anyone they loved. This is the ship that answers the question this entire video opened with. Not a metaphor. Not an exaggeration. An actual concrete battleship with no engine of its own, whose only cargo was dessert, built because the United States military genuinely believed a warm scoop of something sweet could hold a homesick army together better than almost anything else they could ship overseas. And remember those sailors on the Lexington, raiding the freezer before the order to abandon ship. That instinct was everywhere in this war. Destroyer crews who fished down pilots out of the ocean sometimes treated the rescue as an informal trade with the carrier the pilot belonged to, 10 gallons of ice cream handed over in exchange for the safe return of one airman. One rescued pilot later said, only half joking, that the destroyer crew greeted him like a long-lost brother, and that what they were actually happy to see was not him, but the 10 gallons of ice cream he was worth. When the war ended and rationing finally lifted, Americans celebrated by eating more than 20 quarts of ice cream per person in a single year, roughly one full quart every 2.5 weeks for every man, woman, and child in the country. And buried inside all of this is one more story, the kind you cannot make up. Running a small Navy store in the South Pacific on the island group now known as Vanuatu, a lieutenant named Bert Baskin looked at a Jeep sitting nearly useless on his posting and looked at an aircraft carrier's surplus ice cream freezer sitting equally useless nearby, and made a trade that would have sounded insane to anyone back home. A working military vehicle handed over in exchange for a broken-down freezer, just so he could keep making ice cream out of whatever local fruit he could find, for the men serving alongside him in the middle of nowhere. When the war ended, his brother-in-law, an Army veteran named Irv Robbins who already owned a few ice cream stores back home in Southern California, convinced him to go into business together. Bert Baskin and Irv Robbins. Baskin-Robbins. A brand almost everyone watching this has personally bought ice cream from, born out of one soldier trading a military vehicle for a freezer, in the middle of the Pacific, during the deadliest war in human history. If a wartime Jeep trade turning into a company you have actually bought from is the kind of hidden history that gets you, subscribe to BeforeCommon right now because there is one more twist left in this story, and it brings everything back to where it began. After the war, ice cream kept evolving. In the 1930s, Tom Carvel developed a secret soft-serve formula and patented his own low-temperature machines. In 1938, in Kankakee, Illinois, a father and son named J.F. and Alex McCullough tested their own soft-serve recipe with an all-you-can-eat sale that handed out over 1,600 servings in 2 hours, more than one every 4.5 seconds. Their friend running that store was named Sherb Noble. The company they built together became Dairy Queen. Ice cream trucks rolled through suburban streets, their chimes becoming one of the most recognizable sounds of American childhood. Home freezers made it something you could keep in your own kitchen without a servant, an ice house, or a fortune. It became, finally and completely, an everyday thing, sitting in nearly every grocery store on Earth for a few dollars a container, in flavors the Tang Dynasty emperors could not have imagined, sold to children who will never think twice about how ordinary it has become. And then something almost poetic happened. In 1961, a company called Häagen-Dazs launched, with a made-up, vaguely European-sounding name designed to feel foreign and exclusive, despite being entirely American. In 1978, Ben & Jerry's followed, built around the same idea, that ice cream could once again feel like a luxury, something special, something worth paying more for. 2,200 years after Chinese emperors employed 94 men just to manage their private ice supply, modern companies are still selling us the exact same feeling. That this spoonful is not ordinary. That it is something a little bit royal. The packaging changes. The marketing language changes. The underlying instinct never has. Every single person who has ever grabbed a pint from a gas station freezer at midnight has, without knowing it, been chasing the same feeling a Tang Dynasty emperor once employed 94 men to guarantee for himself. The circle really does close, all the way from a mountaintop in ancient China to a supermarket aisle down the street from wherever you happen to be watching this right now. From a mountain in ancient China, to a chemist's discovery in Baghdad, to a legend about a teenage bride that never actually happened, to an overworked woman's $200 patent, to a battleship built entirely out of dessert, to a Jeep traded for a freezer in the middle of the Pacific. This is the actual, documented, occasionally unbelievable journey of something most of us have eaten 1,000 times without ever once wondering where it came from. Somewhere tonight, someone will open a freezer, pull out a carton, and eat straight from it standing over the kitchen counter, without a single thought in their head about mountains, chemists, wars, or ships. And that, in a strange way, is the real ending of this story. Not that ice cream became famous. That it became so unremarkable, so completely beneath notice, that an emperor's impossible luxury turned into something you don't even bother getting a bowl for. That is the entire point of this channel. Every single thing around you, the things so ordinary you have stopped noticing them, has a story exactly like this one hiding underneath it. If you want the next one, subscribe to BeforeCommon and we will find it together.